Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Glassix Spotlight, where today we have the privilege of exploring the intricacies of customer experience with a visionary leader in the field, Karl Sharicz. Karl is a renowned customer experience educator, author, and consultant known for his evidence based approach and innovative strategies that have helped countless businesses achieve their full potential. His expertise spans across B2B organizations in technology, manufacturing, and service sectors, where he has consistently driven customer centric transformations that not only enhance satisfaction, but also deliver measurable financial returns. As the driving force behind HorizonCX, Carl has been instrumental in developing CX strategies that extend customer lifecycles, boost referrals, and solidify customer loyalty. His deep understanding of customer dynamics and systems thinking has made him a trusted advisor for companies looking to convert customer feedback into tangible business results. Carl, it's an honor to have you with us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here, Ron.
It's our absolute pleasure. Well, before we jump into the conversation today, is there any recent project, insight, or anything you think worth sharing that you're particularly excited about?
Well, I have to share this because it's brand new here. I just published my second book.
Oh wow!
So a year ago, I published my first book, which was called CX Pro, and it's a fundamentals for beginners in the space. So it was really geared toward the beginners in the space. And over the past year, I came up with a book number two. And it's actually, I'm the editor of the book. So I had invited in 16 authors. And a couple of those authors have been guests on your podcast before. And you'll recognize some names here. Patty Soltis being one, Eckhart Blume being another, and Mark Slayton being another. There's obviously more authors than that because there's 16 of them
What
here. But
what a trio! Yes.
yeah. And so, no, this is called Beyond the Basics. It's Advanced Insights for Customer Experience Professionals. And so it goes beyond the fundamentals. I mean, the fundamentals are important, you know that, and but there's room obviously to grow from there. So you're always thinking about, okay, now that I've got the basics down, how do I grow within this profession here? And that's what these chapters are all about. And I think the interesting thing about that is that, instead of me being the kind of subject matter expert for all the different things that are in this book, I picked who I believe are the 16 best authors to address each of those individual topics. And I can say a little bit more about that as we get into it. But, suffice it to say that, these are people whose names you might not recognize in the world of customer experience, but nonetheless have had experiences of their own that lend themselves very well to the subjects that they're talking about within the book. So very interesting book to say that 16 authors, it's like if two are better than one, then 16's got to be better than five, right?
I'm blown away by two things mainly. One is that the concept of having exactly 16. I have to ask you about the number, but exactly 16 people that are subject matter experts, each and one of in their niche or micro niche domain within CX. I think that's brilliant, strategy or format. And then the second thing is publishing a book in a difference of only 12 months time from the previous one.
Well,
So
there was that's probably why I went ahead with the second book with 16 authors, because there's no way I could have written another whole book in the 12 months between the last book and this book. There was no way I could do this. So it's really divide and conquer is what it is.
that's a smart strategy. Well, for our audience today, today's episode called Evidence Based Excellence, Karl Sharick's strategic approach to CX mastery. Karl, so I want to get us started with the first question. Your reputation as an evidence based realist in the CX field is well known. how have you seen data driven insights transform B2B organizations? I mean, particularly in the technology and manufacturing sector.
Well, that's a great starting question. Thank you. Well, let me start with this, and that's the idea of being evidence-based realist, as you called me here. I guess you got that off of my LinkedIn profile. Um, my career started within the sciences, and namely chemistry. I have a degree, bachelor's degree in chemistry. And the interesting thing about that is you'd probably wonder, how does someone with a degree in chemistry get into the world of customer experience? Well, there's an evolution here we can get to. But the thing is, I studied and earned my degree in chemistry while simultaneously working in that field, and mostly at B2B manufacturing organizations. And I've done that. I did that for over 25 years. And in my work in the sciences, eclipsed my years of study. So in effect, what I was doing was I was learning and applying myself simultaneously to my work. And and I probably, there's reasons for that. I went to university later. I didn't go right out of high school because in fact, I was in the military for 4 years before, and deciding what I wanted to do with my life. But so that's a different approach than earning a degree in some field of study and then applying yourself after graduation. My work represented a direct application of what I was learning and experiencing within the classroom, and then applying it directly to the work that I was doing. So, as a result, I learned very early in my career about being evidence based, being grounded in how to rely on empirical evidence and observable facts would help in me, and help me make sound decisions. And of course, the emphasis there is on the importance of data, scientific methods, and practical experience informing conclusions based on the research, leading to making better decisions. And then years later, as my work evolved into less of the sciences and more into the world of, I started in the world of training and development, and I was there for a few years before I get into customer experience. And that started to focus more on the humanistic behaviors. But all at the same time, I tended to keep referring to that scientific mindset and methods that I learned earlier, and how that might help me continue making better decisions on the human level. And I landed in the world of customer experience, quite frankly, by chance. And I'd be happy to explain that as well if we have time. I don't know if we have time for that, but I'll just pause for a
Please,
second.
please go
You
ahead.
tell
Yes,
me.
yes, please do that. It's
Yeah.
a, I think it's
Yeah.
a fascinating story. How a person that, let's just call it like that, you had no relation to the field and you switched gears, or let's just even say completely changed, um, your previous profession, if I might say it like this, into something that is totally different, or
Yeah.
not that different, if I ask you, right?
Well, maybe it isn't. Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. So the thing was, I'm working for a very large North American organization. In fact, I spent 17 years there. But and I started in 1997, and around about 2003 or four, somewhere in that time frame, I've always been curious, and then maybe that comes from the science that I grew up with, and doing experiments in that way and research. But I've always been curious, and so I'm working for the organization, and I'm watching and I'm learning and I'm listening to what they're saying about the customers and the customer experiences that they're having. And I hear all these stories about that. There was a meeting at one time, and the vice president of service got up in front of the company and said, "I'm proud to announce that we have 98% customer satisfaction."
Wow.
And something happened in my brain. I said, that's interesting. How does that come about? So I started getting curious about that, and I started asking a lot of questions. And without getting into too much detail about that, what I was learning was that doesn't sound quite right, and that doesn't sound like very valid at all. And so I happened to mention that to the person I was working for at the time. And he said, "Why don't you write up some notes about that? And I'm going to take that to the senior leadership team and see what they think." And lo and behold, he did that. He took that to the senior leadership team, and they agreed. They had no idea why they would be reporting 98. That's very high satisfaction levels, and because you know
Staggering number.
we know different. We must know different than that because I hear different things then. So one thing led to another, and then all of a sudden, I found myself with an offer to run that function for the company. Now you can imagine what I might have been thinking. I was a business development manager and asking, "So do you want to, handle customer feedback and customer measurement for the company?" And I thought to myself, I was kind of one of those. Okay, why not? I didn't really have a lot to go on other than what I had written in my summary notes here. And they said, "You seem to know something a little bit more than what we think anybody else knows about it in the company. How would you like to run that?" So I said yes. And that's where that began for me. That was 2004, I think. And I got the title, manager of customer, they called it customer intelligence. There's a lot of different words that you can call that, but they called it customer intelligence. And so I said, "Sure, I'll do that." And then, of course, I turned around and asked myself, "Okay, what do I do next? What do I do first? What do I second? What do I do third?" So that's where the learning opportunity began here. Okay, so that's 2004. But suffice to say that because my career has been largely in the B2B technology and manufacturing sectors, and although I must say that a few years ago I did serve in a support capacity to a leader of customer experience at a local community bank. So, I mean, I get to add a little bit of B2B experience to my resume as well. But, being able to take data, which of course the customer experience field is rich with, and combining that with the context around that data, well, leads to information. And information is what we make the best decisions on, and we act accordingly. Now, you said transformation. I know that in your question here. To be honest, I sometimes cringe when I hear the word transformation because that seems to be such a lofty and questionable goal to have. It's really more around change and actually incremental change. And over a longer time, I guess when those incremental changes add up, you might be able to say that a transformation has occurred. But in most instances, that really doesn't happen so quickly within businesses. In my last and final position in the corporate world, which was still that manager of customer experience, I can say that I helped the organization become more customer focused. But that took a solid 10 years of dedicated work on my part to
Wow.
get them, and my team as well, to get to that point. And I'd hesitate to call it anything close to a transformation. And that's the same. I guess say that's the same thing as I worked for the financial services sector. Change happens ever so slowly, at least in organizations I've worked for and those that I've consulted with. Change happens very slowly. So I think you can say transformation, but that's kind of like I've always had that feeling about customer experience being the long-term proposition. This is nothing we have overnight or expectations of. It's not going to happen this year, next year, or even the next 2 or 3 years. It might happen in 5 or 10 years, but it's a long-term proposition. That's kind of the way I look at it.
No, I think I've heard that a few times before. And I think that the only question I have to ask was the journey enjoyable enough?
Oh my gosh, yes. That's why I
100.
stuck with it for the 10 years that I did before I left the corporate world. Oh my God, yes. It was very enjoyable. And I tell you, there's a lot of milestones along the way. Let's put it that way. When you go from nothing to learning everything you need to know or think, then of course, there's never an end to that. There's always something more to learn, right? But that's how long it took me. It took me a good 10 years before I could say I can do this.
Wow. And let's talk a little bit about your experience in customer experience management. You've obviously worked in diverse industries, what are some common misconceptions about CX that you've encountered, and how do you guide companies to rethink their approach? So let's say, for example, you'll have to choose one or two industries that, I don't know, resonate the most with you. Um, and then, like, what are the common misconceptions there?
Well, I mean, there are a few of them here, but let's. How about this? There's the work that I do, internally within corporate sector when I was working, and that ended in 2014, and I became a consultant. And so then there's my work externally with the corporate clients, and I can speak to both of those because there's a difference when it comes to guiding the CX process. Being internal to an organization can be a bit more difficult, and for a number of different factors and reasons. So let's go through a few of them here. First of all, internal politics and organizational dynamics. That's kind of a loaded one right there. But as an internal employee, as a CX manager, you have to navigate company politics, organizational silos, conflicting priorities, and you may get resistance from colleagues who feel threatened by CX initiatives or who prioritize their department goals over the broader customer experience vision. And I know when I first started in the CX role at that organization, I started proposing some different ideas, and I started getting a lot of different pushback from the folks who felt that they had a system in place, even though it was really not a very good system. But you run into those things. But if you're a consultant, on the other hand, you often have a lot more freedom to operate outside those internal politics. And while you do need to understand the dynamics within the organization, you're less entangled in the day-to-day issues. And you're usually perceived as neutral, which of course can make it easier for you to influence change in the organization. Another thing is, accountability and implementation. Internal managers are largely made responsible, not only for strategy, but also for long-term implementation and sustained results. And that requires some continuous buy-in from leadership and ongoing collaboration across functions and departments. And you're pretty much accountable for the success or failure of CX if you're holding that title. As a consultant, though, you typically deliver recommendations or help with short-term projects. Once the work is done, you're not typically involved in the ongoing challenges of implementation, and you're less tied to the day-to-day responsibility. So you got that. Then there's resource constraints. Internally, managers often have to deal with budget limitations or staffing, a lack of authority to make the changes. And you may have to compete with other departments for resources and budget. And you're often required to do a lot more with less. Consultants, on the other hand, though, they're often brought in with a specific budget and a mandate. The scope of their work is usually defined, and they're usually granted the resources that they need to execute their recommendations, within the limits of the engagement or the contract. And then there's perception. Okay, as an internal employee, as a CX manager, you may face some challenges being heard, particularly if the organization is not seeing CX as a top priority. And building influence can take a lot of time, and that's why I think I mentioned earlier the 10 years that I spent doing that. That's part of it. That was perception and influence there specifically, especially if the culture is resistant to customer-centric thinking. If they're a very financially driven organization, it's hard to get. In fact, it was a very old organization, over 100 years old, that I worked for. So there was a lot of entrenchment in the culture there that was hard to change. And kind of therein lies a specific misconception about CX. And I said this before, is the length of time it takes to realize the benefits of customer experience. Short-term expectations tend to creep into the picture, and anyone who spent any amount of time in the CX field knows that it's a long-term strategy, and with no real endpoint, it is a continuous effort. Consultants, though, they're often seen as experts with specialized knowledge, and they recommend a lot, and they carry more weight because they come from the outside perspective. Senior leadership tends to look at them more willing and willing to listen and act on their advice. You know, if a big consulting firm said this, it must be true. You know, that kind of thing. Then there's the career risk that you have here as an internal employee. You face greater personal risk if the initiatives that you're managing fail or don't meet the expectation. Now that turns into job security and career security that could be at stake for you. Consultants don't have that. I mean, they obviously need to maintain their reputation, but they don't face the same risk as internal employees do if a project encounters difficulties. And I could go on. I mean, there's well, I said something about the culture already, but you know, the emotional investment that you have in the organization. You know, as part of the organization, you're embedded in that culture, and that can lead to emotional investments in outcomes. You know, you design something, and that's your baby, and you want to make this work, and it makes it harder to maintain objectivity. You know, you have to balance your personal stake in this with the success of the company. Whereas in consultants, you know, they maintain that distance from the company culture, which allows them to bring in these new perspectives. They can obviously make a position that's, you know, they can challenge assumptions a whole lot more easily than somebody internally can do without that emotional attachment.
I absolutely love this breakdown. And I have to tell you, as a marketer, you answering this question, I have to admit, I had like 5 different blog posts I can write about it. I love the comparison. I like how you broke it down, and I like the comparison between internal stakeholders versus consultant. I think it's huge. I think that is this topic in particular is for somewhat get neglected, or I don't know, but I think it's just brilliant how you did this.
Well, I'm happy that you found that, and it's inspiring you to write blogs about that because that's, you know, this is how we influence here. You know, dialogue and communication is just how we have our opportunities, you know, to influence, you know. And as
You know, I
I'll
mean,
tell
you
you,
know how hard it is to find a unique, fresh perspective that as a blog, there is a non-existent blog for it because there are like gazillion blogs online, right? There's
right.
literally a blog about anything. And I think that what you did right now is you just gave a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure also for our listeners. So
Well, you know, and that's again that's reflected in the book I mentioned here, and I'll say something about that again too. It's that the fresh new perspectives, because you're right. There's a lot of blogs that I can't take all the time to read all these blogs here, but a lot of them are repetitive. You know, they say the kind of the same things. It's not that it's not true. It's just that, well, yes, we've heard this, you know, many times over. Um, the only other thing I would add here in terms of, you know, the misconceptions and now I've experienced within corporations that are highly focused on the financials. And there's an expectation in those organizations and a common misconception that customer metrics somehow rise in the same fashion as revenues and profitability. You know, revenues and profitability doesn't, you know, they grow, you know, they don't have the limits that a
I, lo-
that
I
a
love, I
customer.
love, I love the fact that you brought it up because obviously, please continue. But I love the fact that you brought it up because, you know, from my discussions with CX leaders and with other people in CX or even in customer support leaders, this is a common pain.
Yeah, you know, I mean, okay, so when I worked in the corporate, we had one of the customer metrics was net promoter NPS. Okay, I'll just leave it at that, NPS, because I like to. Sometimes I like to refer to it as score. Sometimes I like to refer to it as systems because they're two different things in my mind. There's NPS, there's Net Promoter Score, and there's Net Promoter System. They are different. Anyway, um, so I once had the CEO. We changed CEOs many times there in the organization. Took me aside and told me, I need to help the company raise its NPS from 50 to 70, and this was supposed to happen over the next year. And the reason, I had to ask why, the reason given to me was that he liked shopping at a very high end retailer in the United States that had an NPS of 70, and that our company, in his mind, should have the same NPS or strive to have as good of an NPS as this high end retailer. And as much as I tried to reason that comparing a B2B manufacturing company to a high end retailer wasn't a valid goal, I was given the goal nonetheless. Okay. And outside of gaming the system, there was no way that I was going to be able to influence and lift the NPS from 50 to 70 over the course of a year in the short term or even over the long term. Okay. So again, there's this common misconception of comparing NPS values across organizations and based on that, setting unrealistic, unachievable goals based on them. And of course, I couldn't meet those goals. I didn't meet those goals, and I suffered the consequences of that as well. I didn't lose my job over it, but it was pretty well known at the end of the year when we were looking at goal setting and goal achievement where I didn't make it. So I would say, that overall, the largest misconception about CX among B2B organizations specifically is that CX is in any way an add on or a quick fix to any of the shortcomings the organization feels it might have, or that it's a one and done activity. It needs to be integral to the overall organizational strategy. And it's not a program or an initiative. It's often called that, an initiative. It needs to be led by the highest level position within the organization. So, I once had the pleasure of being a customer of a well known manufacturer of closed circuit television cameras. This was back, numbers of years ago, where my customer experience was such that I found it was led by the CEO, who was both a savvy business professional and a visionary leader of people, who established a culture of customer centricity that I have never seen ever since. It was the only time I've ever seen an organization operate this way. To say that CX was in their DNA, I know that's a well worn phrase and almost a cliche at this point, but it was absolutely true. And their secret was nothing out of the ordinary for them. It was a servant leader along with employee empowerment. And they followed the spirit and advice of the service profit chain to a T. Now, I'm not going to get into explaining the service profit chain, but if you're familiar with it, and I would encourage listeners to go check out the service profit chain. This came about back in 1997 from three Harvard professors under a book called The Service Profit Chain. Go get that book, read The Service Profit Chain. What they proposed or professed in 1997 is just as relevant today. And it really links customer experience with basically the customer life cycle, from internal service quality through employee engagement to the service quality delivered to customers, who in turn are directly responsible for profitability and growth. So I've said it like in a nutshell there, but I'll let listeners
Love
go
that.
check that out for themselves.
Yes, I
It's
love that.
actually in my first book, the first CX Pro book. I explained that in great detail.
I think it's about time you kind of share a little bit about your two books, where our listeners can find them. Are there can be done like audiobooks, or they just hard copies, or how? What is the best way to get those?
Well, they're available on major book sites such as Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Those are the main ones that you can find it. But you can find them if you look up CX Pro, and that's CX-PRO, all in caps, and the dash in between the CX and Pro. And you're going to find the references to that book probably in a lot of different places. You'll find references to my course that I teach, but um, so the first book came out in August 2023, and that was called A Practical Guide for the New Customer Experience Manager. And it's really the course that I teach expanded with more material than I could possibly have included within the class. And it's a good reference book to those who have completed the class. And I now have 165 folks that have gone through and graduated with their CX Pro certification. And of course, referrals from those graduates are what help drive referrals and
How
more
do you how do
participation.
you how do you get the chance to achieve the certificate? Can this be done online, or there's like
Yeah,
a
it's done in an online exam. It's done in an online exam. So they take the exam after the course, soon after the course, and from the passing score, they earn the CX Pro certification. So yeah, you can find those books on online. And the second one, the one that's most recent here, called Beyond the Basics. This just came out a week ago, basically. And this time, like I said, I brought in 16 different authors, each one to contribute a chapter to the book where I served as the editor. And that's quite a different experience. And the result is a book really that covers CX topics in far more depth than I could have as a sole author. I see a lot of books out there that cover all of the intricate aspects of CX written by a certain author. And I think to myself, well, that person must know everything. I can't know everything, and it was also my intent and opportunity with this book to bring in some fresh new voices to the forefront, people
I think it's a
whose
rare
names and
concept.
recognition are not among those you might commonly hear about or see connected with CX. Yet they all have a deep understanding and knowledge of CX concepts and practices in their particular area of expertise, and they have all had the ability to articulate them very well. So, and the other thing that does is that actually provides an expanded network of colleagues, and that's something I feel does a lot in terms of referrals. And that's extending the lifetime and the life cycle of the clients that are drawn to my business. I've had participants in my course that have taken their positive experiences back to the workplace and recommended that course to their colleagues. And that's resulted in quite a lot of repeat business from the same organization. So, I guess the strategy that I have here is just being good at what you do and being flexible on how you deliver your services to your clients. Because I offer these courses on a monthly format. That's kind of like the standard course. But I collaborate with clients to meet their schedules. So even if in some instances they say, well, we're only able to participate if we were to do this on certain days of the week or certain hours of the day, I'll cater to their schedule and needs rather than leave them to comply with mine. And a lot of times, people offer courses where they have a minimum number of students to be enrolled. I'll do a course of one if that's what it is. I won't make somebody wait. In fact, I had some gentleman out on the West Coast said, I'm so busy with my work here. I want to go take your course, but I could only do this on Saturdays. And I said, okay, let's do it.
Wow,
So, that's where the flexibility I think comes in
beautiful.
here because, you can get you probably can get this kind of education in different ways, but, because mine is a hybrid hands on, it's both self paced and it's online, synchronous online training. You get an opportunity to demonstrate your skills, but the exercises and builds confidence and it builds, you're starting to build the skill into it, whether you're brandy new to the customer experience field or you're early in your career and you've just started. It's what I didn't have back in 2004 when I started. So I figured I'm giving back to the community by doing what I'm doing with the course and that first book. And then with the second book, obviously it's for the more advanced person to go deeper into the discipline and to learn from more people who have more expertise in certain areas.
I'm eager to find what's going to be the third book, what's going to be about. Uh,
It's so funny
because you
that you
completely
asked.
dazzled me with the two different concepts. It's not like you're having like a, you know, uh, kind of a trilogy or even more books than that. They're completely different. They are also aimed for completely different audiences, right?
Yep.
Which is quite fascinating, actually.
Well, you know what? I mean, that thought has occurred to me. So, I mean, I like the trilogies. I like trilogies. So, and then if I do this, it's going to be something kind of that represents the next frontier, because I know it's everybody's around AI now, and AI is the big buzzword, and it's going to solve all the issues and problems. I don't think
Or
that's
not,
necessarily I
or
don't
not.
think that, well, I shouldn't say it has the ability to do great things. It has ability to, kind of with some folks, because, some organizations love that shiny new object and they just want to go grab onto it, don't care what it is, but forget about the humanistic part of this thing, right? So if there's got to be some humanistic elements behind this thing, and then I think if you do that, and you manage the technology rather than the technology managing you, I think you're in good
Exactly.
shape.
That's the point. True. I want to skip over to what I like to call $1 million question. I know a lot of our listeners also are very much fascinated by international markets. So, given your international experience, how do you tailor CX strategies to different cultural contexts? And what challenges have you faced in maintaining consistency across global markets? If there's like a story or even a use case that you think is worth sharing.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's true. I have stories here. How many stories would you like?
I think that the one or even two that are you know can be most resonating with our listeners.
Okay. Well, you know what? Let me take a step back here because, as I mentioned, I started in the world of chemistry and then I went into the world of training and development, and that ended up into the world of customer experience. So those three major areas of business that I've worked in here. So let's look at this through, let's say, the training lens, okay? Because that's what I do today. My courses are offered across the globe. So that's where I have to be prepared with language challenges. I only offer my course in English. And since most of my students are versed in English to some degree, which is good, meaning they understand it better than they might be able to speak it, but I need to keep my pace such that they grasp the concepts. And because this is a certification course, which means they'll be completing an exam after the training, I have to make that easier for them. So I provide the exam now in three languages: English, Spanish, and Canadian French. And that's helped quite a lot, as many of the participants I've had recently come from Mexico. Because my course is hybrid, meaning that it's got the both self-paced and self-study and online synchronous components, it's very interactive, with hands-on exercises, and so they demonstrate their knowledge and skills. So, but the course began as an in-person format where classes were held either here locally in the Boston area, or in instances I had to do some traveling either within the USA or abroad. But of course, COVID changed all that and forced me into an online format. But I decided to go hybrid because it allowed me to, well, do two things. One is it brought in students from afar. So now I'm getting people in my course from across North America, as well as South America, Asia, and India. I just had a class with 6 people from India. The online component makes a big difference in the learning and retention versus just self-paced study format. And that's been a definite competitive advantage for me. And a lot of courses are just self-paced and self-study. And those are good, and you can do it at your own pace. But I think having the discipline to have it at a certain particular times, and we agree on what that is, and I am flexible from that. And then from a consulting client perspective, I've done work with some large global enterprises where the work, let's say one instance where the work involved clients of theirs across different countries and cultures. So, for example, I had this client a while back that wanted to do some voice of the customer work and deploy it in several countries within surveys in the native languages. Now, constructing a large relationship type of survey instrument in 7 different languages was a challenge, to be sure, not only for them, but for me as well. And that relationship survey, when I tell you it had 56 questions in that, you probably go, oh my God, who's going to answer 56 questions? But oddly enough, we were able to get a 36% response rate to that. It was an email deployed survey. So we did very well in getting returns. So I helped them build the survey in English, which then had to be translated into 7 other languages. Not only that, but validated by people who spoke those native languages, because you really can't rely on auto translate to do the conversions
Never
in
rely
such
on
a
auto.
way. What's
Yeah.
that, Ron?
Never rely on auto translate.
Oh
Never.
my gosh, no. Because you're asking the question, you could be making a statement, but you don't know exactly how it's being perceived on the other end, because there are nuances that could confuse them. So we had to make sure that they got translated and then validated by the native speakers. And of course, then after the fact, after you run the VOC, then the results of the survey came in, and there's a lot of open-ended text responses in the native language that had to be converted back to English in the same way, so that I could interpret them and do my work then as an analyst to combine, to combine that with the numeric data that we were receiving for me to deliver a comprehensive report on the findings and to make some recommendations based on what we learned. It was quite an involved process, but it worked. And of course, it helped the organization become self-sufficient, which is what was one of their goals. They wanted me to make them self-sufficient, able to do this without me being there and holding their hand at the whole time. So we were able to move forward, and they were able to move forward without my direct involvement and assistance. I'd check in with them every now and then, but other than that, I consider that a really successful example of working internationally.
Yeah, it is. It is, and I think that putting aside your CX specialties, um, I think that you just made me wonder a lot while you told this story. Um, how can one be successful in the international arena? I mean, there are a lot of different ways you kind of used in order to being receptive to your audience, in order to be um, their north star when it comes to CX. I don't think that I ever heard of a CX leader like yourself, for example, that sharing their knowledge and their CX wisdom or magic, we like to call it, um, and being so available. I think that's I can relate to that, because I think that one of the soft skills that a leader should have, that a good leader should have, is being available and being receptive. And I think you just shared that in your own way.
Yeah, you actually have to be. You know what I mean? I know there's a lot of consultants that have that sort of rigidity
Trust
around.
me, Carl, I know so many leaders, especially in the CX and marketing spaces, and they're not either available nor, receptive. But, for you, it sounds, so obvious, but
Yep.
I'm still very much thrilled about, you sharing this in your own way.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. So, on to our last question of the day. And I really like this one. So, if you could design a new metric for measuring CX success that goes beyond traditional KPIs, what would it be and why?
Wow, that's a good question. It's a new metric for measuring customer experience success. Well, I think one thing I can say is there's already a metric for measuring customer success, and that was developed some years ago by Forrester based on 3 dimensions of customer interactions. And you might have heard of this: success, effort, and emotion. Success being the component, did I get what I was aiming for? Did I get it? Did I receive it? The effort, was it easy for me to get, to obtain? And some emotional component. How did the experience leave me feeling? And I think you can almost think of any interaction you've had with the business, you can measure by the components success and effort and emotion. I had an experience with a company. I will not mention their name here because I don't want to implicate them here, but I was buying a computer online over the phone, actually. And did I get what I want? Eventually. Was it easy for me to obtain? Not very. How did the experience leave me feeling? Pretty miserable. So there you can see I did get what I want. It wasn't easy and it left me feeling rather drained. So you add up those and you say to yourself, what does that mean in terms of customer experience? That's not such a good one right there. Now, I mean, granted, that was a developed, that metric was developed more as a contact center measure, of customer success. But I'll tell you, and I think you might have touched upon this in the beginning when we first started talking, the service experience is often the real measure of overall customer success. I think you probably know that from the business you're in. That service component really can be the critical make it or break it. Brand needs to be reliable and product needs to work, but it's what happens after that sale that keeps the customer in satisfaction state, loyal state, and hopefully in an advocate state. Some organizations I find put way too much emphasis on a single metric, such as NPS or overall satisfaction. And while they're both valid metrics of customer experience when they're used in combination with one another, but they're indicators. I always like to make this analogy. If you're flying an airplane, there's a bunch of instruments on the dashboard, right? And you need all of them. You can't fly the plane on just one. So if I said, okay, you're going to fly this plane, Ron, all you have to go by is an altimeter. That's it. You don't have airspeed indicator. You don't have the others. You just only have the altimeter. I'm not going to be too successful. And the other thing here is that, and I said this earlier, when NPS is used as a metric by itself, when it's used as the score, it provides little more than one indicator, unless it's used within the system in which it was designed to be used. And that's the Net Promoter System, which is more than just a metric, which Fred Reichheld went to great lengths to explain in the beginning, and now with his most recent book. You can read all about that. That's, to me, the most effective customer metric that I ever used was called the Secure Customer Index. And people may not be familiar with it, but it's dated back to a few years ago. It was developed by a gentleman by the name of Randy Brandt, who I know personally, when he worked for Merit. And that was an index of overall satisfaction measure, a likelihood to remain a customer measure, and a likelihood to recommend measure. So those three measures, satisfaction, likelihood to continue doing business, and likelihood to recommend. And you combine those as an index. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but that's how I kept away from relying on a single metric, because I had an organization that was NPS obsessed. And I tried to get them away from that. So we started using this thing called Secure Customer Index. And, all those numbers, though, derive, those are metrics that come from the customer's own admission. I mean, you're asking customer for overall satisfaction, likelihood to remain, likelihood to recommend. That's their feeling and their admission. But you also can't forget that you have internal operational metrics, which measure the success of the company. And those include, some internal measures like the customer retention rates, customer spend, market share. And so to me, together, those can be woven into the story that you build around customer success. Because if the customer is successful, the business will thrive and ultimately be successful. And I don't think we need more or
I
newer
love I
metrics. I
love
guess
the
that's my
direction.
answer. I don't think we need a new one for measuring customer success. What we need to do is effectively use the ones we have and treat them as a system, and to look for correlations and causations and not focus so much on an individual metric because it's a popular one, because
I love
everyone
the
else is doing
love
it,
the
so I
direction.
can compare to. Yeah, so that's my take on that one.
I think it's brilliant. From what I understood, and correct me if I'm wrong here, this is how I vision it right now. Like just what I took from what you just said is build your own flywheel. It's cross departmental. Combine the right metrics, and you should be good.
Yep. And and like I said, build the story. It doesn't have to be quantitative only or qualitative only. Just build a story around all of it. Internal operational metrics as well as customer external in customer metrics.
It's beautiful. Carl, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It was an enjoyable conversation and very insightful one. For our listeners who wants to follow Carl, I urge you to do that. He's very active on his LinkedIn for more CX wisdom. Carl, thank you so much for joining us.
Ron, thank you so much for having me, and have a great day, afternoon, whatever is in your future.
Thank you.